Welcome, everyone. Greetings from Providence, Rhode Island, to everyone joining us today. My name is Arthur Urbano. I teach in the theology department at Providence College and am chair of the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee. And on behalf of all the committee members, I'd like to welcome you all to today's discussion, Jewish Catholic Relations in a Volatile World, a conversation on the legacy of Pope Francis and future directions under Pope Leo XIV, with our guests, Gavin D'Costa and Karma Ben-Johanan. It's good to see so many people here today. So after a pontificate of 12 years, Pope Francis passed away on Easter Monday of this year. And 17 days later, Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost was introduced to the world as Leo XIV. Since then, Catholics and non-Catholics alike have been asking, wondering, and speculating about whether and how Pope Leo will continue the legacy of Pope Francis in different areas and how he will carve out his own path as visible head of the Catholic Church. And this comes at a time when much change, fear, tragedy, and volatility grip our world today. Today, our panelists will discuss the dynamics of one of these issues, and that is the relations between Jews and Catholics under Pope Francis and the future directions that may or should unfold in the years to come. This topic is especially timely as we turn our attention this year to the 60th anniversary of the promulgation of Nostra Aetate, the Vatican II document that reshaped Jewish-Christian relations. So let me start here by introducing our speakers and then just some logistics on how our forum will work today. Professor Gavin D'Costa is professor at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, the Angelicum, and emeritus professor of Catholic theology at the University of Bristol in the UK. He has authored 8 monographs, most recently Catholic Doctrines on the Jewish People after Vatican II, and has co-edited Contemporary Catholic Approaches to the People, Land, and State of Israel with Phaedra Shapiro. He is an advisor to the Roman Catholic bishops in England and Wales on matters related to other religions and has worked with the World Council of Churches and the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. Professor Karma Ben-Johanan is a historian of modern religion, specializing in contemporary Jewish-Christian relations, church-state relations, and anti-Semitism. She teaches in the Department of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Previously, she served as a professor at the Faculty of Theology at the Humboldt Universität zu Berlin, where she held the chair of Jewish-Christian Relations. She's the author of Jacob's Younger Brother, Christian-Jewish Relations After Vatican II, which was awarded several prestigious prizes. She was also the coordinator of an open letter addressed to Pope Francis by more than 400 Jewish rabbis and scholars in November of 2023, to which the Holy Father replied. She's currently leading a research project sponsored by the European Research Council titled Christo-Semitism, A History of Christian Anti-Semitism in Europe, 1945 to 2020. Now, before I hand the floor over to Professor D'Costa, who will get us going, just a couple of housekeeping items for our audience. Please note that we are recording today's discussion. Second, please keep your mics muted throughout the program. There will be time for Q&A at the end. And because of our numbers, and so we're able to address as many of your questions as possible, I'm going to ask you to place any questions you have in the Q&A box. So not the chat, but in the Q&A. And if you don't see the Q&A immediately at the bottom, there's a menu item that says more with 3 little dots, and sometimes it's over there if you don't see it. I don't know why it's not in a more prominent place. So when we arrive at the Q&A portion, I'll moderate the questions for our panelists. If you're interested in learning more about the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee and the events that we host, you can visit our website at jewish-catholic.providence.edu. And if you'd like to be updated by email, you can join our mailing list by contacting us at jcte@providence.edu. And I'll put both of those in the chat a little later. So we'll begin with a presentation from each panelist, and then there will be time for them to talk with each other before we move on to the Q&A. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Gavin D'Costa to get us started.
Okay, thank you very much, Arthur. Thank you very much, Karma, for also being willing to engage in this conversation. So I'm very excited to be here. And hello, various people on the video, people I recognize, but I can't go through all your names. Okay, so I've got 20 minutes, and I want to just first make some preliminary comments before getting to Pope Francis. So the first comment would simply be that, in my view, the Catholic Church has a very long and dark history of anti-Jewishness and anti-Semitism in its theological thinking, in its canonical thinking in terms of canon law, in terms of its practices, and liturgically. And in the year 2000, we had that remarkable moment of repentance being expressed, which is just the beginning of a long process. And this deep, deep scar continues, despite you can change church teachings. And in 64, 65, we have Vatican II and a shift of teachings, but it is in the bloodstream, and it can't be kind of seen as something that is gone and sorted. So this is a real issue. The second point I want to make is the resurgence of anti-Semitism today is profoundly pernicious and worrying, and is quite, if you like, global. And while in some respects one has to take into consideration modernity's contribution to that, and neo-paganism, certainly Christian theological anti-Jewishness has to be considered. And the third point I want to make is that despite the remarkable teachings of Lumen Gentium 14 to 16 and Nostra Aetate 4, there's a lot of work to be done. But I just want to underline the two major doctrinal points in those documents, and that will help us to chart the journey a little bit. So the two doctrinal major points, as I see it in the council, the first was that the Jews are not guilty for the death of Jesus Christ collectively, or in fact during that period. And Nostra Aetate has this beautifully balanced, careful wording so that it keeps faithful to Scripture, but removes, if you like, the thorn that was clearly, in the view of Jules Isaac, the root of anti-Jewish thinking in theology, to remove, if you like, the deicide charge. The second important doctrinal point was the teaching that God's irrevocable covenant with his people, citing Paul from Romans, is in place. God doesn't go back on his word. God remains faithful to that covenant. And then pretty well after 64 and 65, we have the unfolding implications of that. Now, the third and most interesting, maybe for our talk at the council, anti-Semitism is condemned in all its shapes and forms, and by whoever did it, in brackets. We're not mentioning any names or going to implicate the church, but there it was, clearly. And one of the points I want to make in this talk is that while there is a clear, unambiguous condemnation of anti-Semitism, there's never been in the church a clear definition of what anti-Semitism constitutes and is. And that's a really big issue for the future. So Pope Francis, a few comments. Shaped very much by his Argentinian Latin American sensibilities, which can be contrasted with two popes who come out of the heart of Europe's Holocaust experience. So we have John Paul II in Poland, and we have Pope Benedict coming out of Bavaria in Germany. So the two previous popes we can see were deeply tuned in, even though Benedict made various kind of wrong-footed moves, but I think we're deeply tuned into this question. Pope Francis had slightly, I think, different primary concerns on his agenda. The first thing he did when he was elected Pope was visit the dispossessed and marginalized. He did this remarkable move in Europe to go and visit refugees who were having a very hostile environment. And his sympathies were always, if you like, with the perceived underdog. Now, with Israel, he did carry out all of the important moves. He visited the Jewish synagogue in Rome in 2016. He visited Israel in 2014. He convened a prayer meeting in 2014 and 24 between Palestinian and Israeli leaders, Jewish leaders, to kind of bring a new perspective. And I think it's important to recognize this mixed heritage, i.e., very, very good things, carrying on the traditions. But it can be said that even before October the 7th, he had already stumbled into certain stereotypical depictions, like the Pharisees, the old idea of the Pharisees doing the law. Christianity is a religion of grace, and the contrast between the two. He brought this up in 2021, and frankly, it was pretty embarrassing. Cardinal Koch had to rush in and do an emergency job of trying to explain that this wasn't what it seemed like. And in one sense, I think it showed us that deep under the skin, there were kind of stereotypic prejudices that exist amongst so many Catholics, including myself, I should say, even when I should know better. So I don't want to kind of say this is disastrous. I think he's human, frail, and working out of that tradition. But of course, the comments after October the 7th attacks by Hamas, where he seemed to equate both groups with terrorist activities. And here, there's a big discussion, but the problem of saying that seemed to suddenly equate, if you like, the issue of self-defense, which is what, in my view, and in many others, Israel was carrying out, and the issue of proportionality or disproportionality in that self-defense. But to use the word terrorism as he did seemed to totally unbalance the scales, and that created a long-running discussion. And of course, Karma and her many colleagues were, I think, immensely generous in the letter to Pope Francis concerning that matter. But, I couldn't quite believe it. But on the first anniversary of October the 7th, when speaking to Middle Eastern Christians, he spoke about the importance of peace and wrote, "Catholics must never tire of imploring peace from God." And he called for a day of prayer and fasting. And here is the line: "To defeat our one true enemy, the spirit of evil that foments war because it is murderous from the beginning, quote, a liar and the father of lies," citing John 8:44. So this was sort of shocking that some advisor hadn't pointed out, or someone hadn't said, hey, John 8:44 is the most used text when vilifying the Jews, who are liar and father of lies in the Johannine dialogue. Now, New Testament scholars have kind of contextualized that and criticized it. But the point is, this particular use of John echoes so much of the history of Christian anti-Jewishness, and therefore using this text on the first anniversary created again very, very uncomfortable feelings between Jews and Catholics. So in summary, I think it would be fair to say Francis's legacy was both full of blessings and grace and a continuity of the Council's teachings, and he made it totally clear on the two doctrinal points of the deicide charge ain't true and the covenant continues and is never revoked. That's clear. But then we have, if you like, what I'd say were the shadow sides of elements of pre-conciliar teaching. So what is the conclusion I want to make about Pope Francis's legacy? The first is, and I don't say this flippantly, but usually it takes about 400 years for any council teaching to hit the ground and permeate the church. You know, this is a big, huge group of people. And who reads Vatican documents, to be honest, in terms of Catholic pews? And when I teach at the Angelicum and I start working on these documents, okay, my students who are actually the elites in so much as they're priests and nuns, etc., haven't necessarily read the council documents. Surprise, surprise, they're very long and some are quite boring and not that relevant. So in effect, the first point I want to make is that there is a slow process which really has to go fast of Catholics being educated about their own teaching. And that may also be the case for high-ranking prelates and even popes, where these teachings take time to permeate. That's not by way of an apology or a defense. It's simply saying that's the situation. The second point I want to make is that none of what Francis said in terms of the issues I've pointed out, and there are many more, were said with actual formal magisterial authority. So this is like, you know, if he says Argentina is the best football team, am I as a Catholic bound to support Argentina or just acknowledge by supporting England I'm on to a loser, which I may well be in that case. But the point is that doctrinally and magisterially, there is no shift. There is still, the ship is moving steadily on with the kind of problems one would expect. And third and final point I want to make is it's kind of interesting and important to ask the question about how do Catholics engage with Islamic anti-Semitism. So very interestingly, Francis has a very important document with the head of Al-Azhar University in Egypt, Ahmad Al-Taib, who is well known for many initiatives, but also well known for various of his anti-Semitic comments. So there are general denunciations of nationalism, anti-Semitism in the religions, but there's this complex question of dealing with on-the-ground forms of anti-Semitism, which are related to interfaith dialogue. So that's a kind of question mark. So to move now to Pope Leo, fortunately, it's very, well, not fortunately, but it's very difficult to assess the papacy. You know, it's fresh, it's new, but just two symbolic points. The first is on the actual day of his election. Now, the Holy Spirit must have tipped him off, or he's super efficient. On the day of his election, he wrote to Rabbi Marantz, the director of interreligious affairs at the American Jewish Committee, and wrote, "Trusting in the assistance of the Almighty, I pledge to continue and strengthen the Church's dialogue and cooperation with the Jewish people in the spirit of the Second Vatican Council's declaration Nostra Aetate." That's a really, really good move, and one that, you know, makes us think, great, here's a Pope tuned in. Second point is to say that this is a Pope who's from an American background. And in that sense, US Catholicism, in my view, is, along with German Catholicism, very much in the forefront of keeping Jewish Catholic concerns alive. And of course, one of his teachers, Father John Palawowski, is a pioneer with really an important contribution to this area and taught Pope Leo. So one might say that he is much more possibly sensitive and connected, and his treatment so far of the conflict is already facing, with the Catholic Church being hit by shrapnel with 3 deaths and injuries, and Bibi Netanyahu ringing up the Pope to apologize for this. But we can see some shift in dynamic. With Francis, official delegates didn't even turn up from Israel. It was just not just, but the ambassador present. So there's at least a shift on that front. So in the last 5 minutes I have, I'd say I'm looking forward to this pontificate. I'm very excited about it. I think it's good news in all sorts of ways, and we will have to keep, the channels open and see what happens. But I just wanted to kind of ask the question, so what are the future tasks for the Catholic Church in this area of Jewish Catholic engagement? So I'd say number one, it's actually teaching Catholics what the Church teaches, the teachings of the Council and post-conciliar teachings at the magisterial level about this issue. And when I started, and I said it normally it takes 400 years for a council's teachings to permeate through, I would actually be so bold as to say the speed at which the teachings about the Jewish people have gone through limited but small pockets of the Catholic Church and the Catholic hierarchy is remarkable. You just have to read the 2015 document celebrating 50 years of Nostra Aetate, and it would give you a heart attack if you weren't prepared for the kind of claims being made. And truly, this is very interesting. When I work through this document with my students, they are surprised and sometimes totally shocked at the evolution of the teaching. Now, remember the 2015 document published by the Pontifical Council for Religious Relation with the Jews isn't a magisterial document and doesn't claim to be, but it shows you that the thinking is in advance. But the wider education is very, very important. So that's point number one. Point number two would be the question of what is anti-Semitism is a profoundly important one. One example of this would be simply to say, is being anti-Zionist anti-Semitic? Now, if we go by the IHRA definition, which has been accepted by a number of countries, accepted by my university in the UK, the answer is yes. If you are anti-Zionist, that's deemed anti-Semitic. But there are huge problems with that logic and even the actual formulation of the teaching in IHRA's documents. So there are alternative definitions, but the point I'm wanting to make is this. You can't be totally committed to saying you're anti-Semitic when you don't know what it means, if in your official documents you don't unfold it. So my little suggestion would be for the second edition of the Compendium for Catholic Social Teaching, or the Compendium of Social Doctrine, as it's called, which is a total goldmine, that issue needs to be addressed. And this is where Pope Leo could be a great guy in terms of his concern with the social teachings of the Church. Taking on the name of Leo indicates that already. So we need to address that. Third point would be the importance of working practically for justice and peace together as Jews and Christians united, despite our differences, despite our political differences, being committed to work for justice and peace. And here I kind of point out to both Karma's letter to the Pope with her colleagues and a more recent intervention sent out to Catholic colleagues by herself and another Jewish teacher in Israel, expressing commiseration, regret, and sadness at the bombing of the church or the hitting of the church in Gaza. And these kind of gestures really mean a lot because they're based on building up friendships and trust. The final point I want to make in now 28 seconds is I think the question of the land should be addressed by Catholic theologians. Very often they have been asked, and Jewish folk ask, so what is the meaning of this God doesn't go back on his covenant, when the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament clearly has one of the covenantal elements as the land? So straightforward question, if you say God does not go back on his gifts and promises, and one of those is the land, what do we as Catholic theologians make of that? And that's a really important question that can't be shelved. Okay, thanks for listening, and I hand over to Karma.
Okay, and as we're transitioning over to Karma, just a reminder that if you have questions for our speakers, to please place them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Thank you. With that, Karma, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, so hello everyone. On my side, it's good evening. And thank you again for the invitation to join this event. I'm happy to be here, excited to speak with my colleague and friend Gavin D'Costa, and also very excited that you're all here, especially as this is an audience that has both Catholics and Jews, which shows that it's really significant for both our communities. And this is something that I find moving. And I would like to both start with, with marking Nostra Aetate and its legacy, and even celebrating the achievements that were made during these last decades. I think there are definitely parts that are worth celebrating. And I would like to especially highlight the fact that we're talking about two worlds that are so wide and so diverse and so difficult to bring together, and to start such a significant process that really takes root and really mobilizing both communities, both the Jewish community and the Catholic community, in such a consistent way. I think this is remarkable. I don't know of many processes, historical or cultural processes, that work this way. And in this sense, it really is an inspiration. And of course, like all great things, it's incomplete and it has its deficiencies. But this is part of what makes it such a huge achievement. So I would like to be with that for a second. But since we are also talking about a crisis, like Gavin already highlighted, then this will also be at the center of my 20 minutes here. And I would like to start with the moment that we're in. And Gavin already mentioned that, but a week ago, the IDF mistakenly kills 3 Catholics in the community of Gaza and wounded many others. So maybe we should take the moment, first of all, to share the grief of the families and of the community, and also to wish the wounded swift recovery, and also to hope for the end of this very long and terrible war, terrible for all sides. And I would also say the release of the hostages and the end of the suffering of the Gazans, and also the end of the rule of Hamas. So this is what I'm hoping for. And I think it's important to mention also here as we continue. Okay, so now I would like to say something about where the crisis begins. in my opinion. And for this, maybe we should go back to the Second Vatican Council and say a few things. Some of them were already mentioned, but I will try to take them in a slightly different direction. So when we're speaking about the Second Vatican Council, in terms of Jewish-Christian relations, of course, we're talking about the Shoah, the Holocaust, but we're also talking about rebuilding European civilization, looking for the sources, the resources that will enable a recovery of the continent, of the world that is related to this culture. And this is something that, of course, the church was very invested in. When we're talking about the Second Vatican Council, we're already talking about processes of decolonization and processes of the globalization of the church. We already have communities that are getting stronger outside of the West. However, this is still a Eurocentric church, and the consciousness, the historical consciousness, is very much rooted in European history. And indeed, in attempting, it comes, right, in interreligious dialogue in general, comes with the transition towards a liberal, towards liberal democracies, towards the freedom of religion. So the church makes many changes also in this regard, and these things are obviously connected. And this is also a project. We also have Jews that their European past is still very close, right? When we're thinking about the 1960s, Israel is very, very young. The memory of the Holocaust is, people of the same generation are there, and also people who grew up in Europe before the war and bring their own Jews that bring their own Europeanism into this dialogue. So we have, to a great extent, a Western experience of both Jews and Catholics. This is, of course, no longer the case. It's no longer the case for the Catholic Church, where more than half of the Catholic Church, if I'm not mistaken, do not live in Western countries. They live in Africa, in South America, in Asia. And also half of the Jewish world is in the Middle East. And Europe is, of course, empty. It's less empty than it used to be, but still it's a very small minority of Jews that live in Europe. And the majority communities are in the United States and in Israel. And this sociology changes things significantly because theology, I'm a historian, so for me, it always exists also within a context, especially Jewish-Christian relations. Theology is always intertwined with history, with politics, with power relations, etc. And we see here this transition that demands our attention. And we also have now, since the title is in a volatile world in general, we also have a big crisis of liberalism, as we noticed in several places around the globe these days. And since liberalism and the transition to liberal democracies was so significant also in invigorating Jewish-Christian dialogue, it is also a question: what exactly is the context, is the framework in which Jewish-Christian dialogue, Jewish-Catholic dialogue should operate when these values that seem so related to what we're able to do are to a great extent compromised. The flaws of liberalism are also surfing, and this certainly influences the dialogue as well. So, and this brings me to the pontificate of Pope Francis, and which kind of correlates with the last decade, right, with the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, even though he started a little before, but still we have this, more or less this correlation. And it seems to me that one thing that was very prominent is that gradually the sense was that the major issues between Catholics and Jews have been resolved already. So the church did its heavy lifting, which is to a great extent true, of course. I think the church really did a long way from the teaching of contempt, to use Julie Zach's wording. And yet the idea was that the age of polemic is now behind us. We're done And this was very strong, I think, in 2015. It was also kind of backed by the reception in the Jewish world. There were several important documents that came out from the Jewish world at that time. And then I think on both sides, there was much less investment in the dialogue between between Catholics and Jews since that time. This comes together with the fact that we're talking about the first pope that comes from South America, that comes from the global South. Like Gavin said, that it comes with also with a different consciousness, with a different set of memories. And it seemed like a good, clean page in Jewish-Catholic relations in the beginning, but gradually some problems started to surface, because when there is less investment in Jewish-Catholic dialogue, so many of the old problems surface. This is true also for the Jewish world. I think the Jewish world was much more invested in Jewish-Catholic dialogue in the United States and in the small communities in Europe than in Israel. And this is partially because of the the big secular community in Israel, which does not recognize itself within Jewish-Catholic dialogue. That sounds very religious. So in the secular community in Israel, in a way, it didn't connect. What kind of relationship should Israeli secular Jews have with the church? While on the other hand, there is a big Orthodox community that goes slowly with this dialogue and has reservations, both because of the very difficult past and also because of several halachic issues. And so something fell kind of between the chairs. I don't know if it exists in English, but this is how we say it in Hebrew. And Israel, not completely, of course, but stayed a bit of an alien to the dialogue that went on and continued to be very focused on Western or American Jewish communities, etc. And there is much less investment in education, while on the other hand, as Gavin already mentioned, there is much more investment in the dialogue with Islam, which makes sense, which is to some extent natural. Also, when we're talking about the global South, of course, Islam is much more of a significant other than the Jews, who are almost non-existent in these areas, except for in the New Testament, which is, of course, a challenge in its own right. And also in Europe, we have much more Islam in Europe, much more Islam than Judaism in Europe. And this, of course, creates a lot of investment on the side of Catholic communities, which again makes sense, but it gets difficult when this is no longer an inclusion, right? It's no longer including Muslims in the dialogue that has already been achieved with Jews, but some kind of a supersessionism, right? The Jews were very relevant to a certain point. Now this is no longer the case. This is no longer important, and something else is important instead of that. And sometimes we see this supersessionistic dynamic. I think this exists also regardless of the church, this tension between what is the greater evil, anti-Semitism or colonialism. We have a narrative that is becoming more and more prevalent that anti-Semitism was indeed a problem, but the West was able to solve this problem, to repent its anti-Semitic sin, and now it's time to also repent and amend the problem of colonialism, of neocolonialism, of imperialism of various sorts. And there is sometimes a paradigm that presents a clash between these two. So one has to choose. And this, I think, is globally a problem, and it also finds its way to Jewish-Catholic relations. So, and now I want to say a few things about the war, even though Gavin already set the background for all of that. I would only say that I think for many in the Jewish communities around the world, the issue was, you said equation, right? Thinking about Israel in terms of terror. It seems to me that the issue was more that Israel is sometimes depicted, and it was true for several of Francis's speeches and addresses, but also in many other discourses, as if Israel doesn't have real enemies, right? Mentioning Hamas was something extremely rare. Also mentioning Hezbollah, mentioning Iran in terms of the real threats that Israel is facing, the very difficult situation in which Israel is when it's not fighting a state, but it's not exactly not a state, right? It's a terror organization. So how do you frame this? And the framing was very, very clear, perhaps too clear, I would say. This noble motivation of being always with the victims, which really is noble, didn't leave room for the complexity in which Israel was. And very often it seemed that Israel is the ultimate perpetrator, and this is its only role within this conflict. I think this was difficult. This was rather a difficult point. Okay, so that is, and again, talking about the Pharisees and all of these mentions of like older pre-Vatican II tropes that were often part of the polemic between Jews and Christians and Catholics. I think, in my opinion, this really, it just shows a lack of investment, right? What happens when we don't purposely invest in purging our traditions from hostility? And I think we have, of course, instances of anti-Christianity also in Judaism, and very quickly, when we do not invest in these, in reading properly our traditions, then these things come up without anybody wanting to be, having these hostile sentiments or anything of this sort. It's really part of the culture, and we have to resist this if we don't want these things coming back. So now I would like to, before referring to Pope Leo, I would like to say a few things about the question of definition of anti-Semitism that Gavin touched in the end. Though I also have some affinity towards definitions, I think in this situation, definitions are not helping. And I'll say why. First of all, because in the current discourse, both possibilities, and Gavin mentioned the IRA definition, which includes anti-Zionism within the definition of anti-Semitism. We also have the Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism, which separates between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I would say that both of these definitions are now weaponized one against the other. It's impossible to avoid the politicization of the discourse on anti-Semitism once you adopt one of these statements or declarations or definitions. And in the end, the Jews themselves are weaponized for these political issues. So I think this is really dangerous at the moment. And I wouldn't want the church to get involved in this debate about the two poles. But I would also like to say that both definitions are lacking in a very, very specific point, and this is religion. So neither the Jerusalem Declaration nor the IRA definition include anything that has to say anything about Christianity, the place of Christianity in the evolution of anti-Semitism, of anti-Judaism. So this is very complex, but in order to understand, as you already mentioned, the places where this comes from, I think religion is very important. And I will say one more thing, that I think now also the dynamic is much, to me, it's much more, it reminds much more of classical Christian anti-Judaism than of racist Nazi anti-Semitism. For example, in the sense that it's not against the Jews as Jews, it is against the Jews as Zionists, right? And once you renounce your Zionism and your ties with Israel, you're fine. So there is this push towards conversion that is very, very strongly sense within Jewish communities. Sometimes, of course, the renunciation of Zionism is very authentic. Sometimes the pressure is very social and very cultural, and many Jews feel that they simply have to put themselves in this situation. I would also say that anti-Zionism doesn't have to be anti-Semitic in order to be evil. It can be evil without being anti-Semitism. And it is very obvious when anti-Zionism crosses the line from a legitimate criticism to something else. We often think that it's not so clear, but in fact, it's clear if you want. If you're fine with a Jewish state and you want it to be better and you want it, and you can also resist the war. Of course, there are many Israelis who are Zionists. I think half of the country, at least, maybe more at this moment, that does not support the war, that does not support the government, but it does support Israel. It supports the idea of a Jewish state. It supports the idea of a connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And this is really something else. This is not anti-Zionism. It's criticism of Israel. So we should not, of the politics, the specific politics of Israel, not the very existence of the state. And here I think the line is very crucial. And sometimes, so very clearly we see this slipping between the lines also in many Catholic circles, I think, around the globe today. So since I have to finish in something like 2 minutes, according to my count, I will say something about Pope Leo XIV. And also I joined Gavin in not knowing a lot what to say. My sense is that there is something very careful in his approach. He understands, I think, the delicacy of the situation, but we will only find out exactly what kind of approach he will formulate, I guess, quite soon with Nostra Aetate and marking of this anniversary. But to me, I'm very optimistic actually about Pope Leo's Augustinianism, and maybe I'll say a word about that. I think many Jews are actually concerned because Augustine has a very ambivalent approach towards Jews, and it was very influential also in dark times in Jewish Catholic relations. By the way, not only in dark times, he's also responsible for many good things. So he really is an ambivalent figure, but I don't want to highlight at all his approach to Jews and Judaism, but rather his approach to human societies as fallen societies. So his idea that there is no society that is free of sin. He's anti-Manichaean in a very strong way, right? It's not that you have the good ones and the bad ones, and you can really differentiate in this world. You can never differentiate. The good and the evil are always intertwined. And also peace is always very fragile. It is never complete. It is never pure. So there is no quest for purity. In a sense, Augustine is anti-messianic, you could say, in terms of his conception of history. And this gives me a lot of hope. This is the sort of complexity that I think is extremely necessary now in order to get out of the plot that we somehow found ourselves in. So I'm hoping to see something of this quality, but of course the days will tell us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karma, for that. So now the panelists will have some time to talk to each other and to respond to questions and ideas that have been brought up.
Okay, well, I'll go first because I see the mic muted on Karma's end. But to say that there's an enormous amount of very helpful comments that you made, which I find you're sifting between different types of anti-Zionism, some being not anti-Semitic and some being so. That's a very helpful way to proceed. your comments about the politicization of the discourse connected with these definitions. Maybe if I just pick up one point there, which is interesting. So the issue you know, I mean, it's very difficult sometimes, I think, listening to, say, Benjamin Netanyahu, who will constantly respond to almost every criticism that comes up as being anti-Semitic. And then you begin to think, okay, so what could I say here that could have space to be listened to? And I think this is the comments you're making kind of really help, but I'm wondering if we just abandon definitions, and it may not be helpful, as you said. I'm wondering whether, for me, one of the big questions that has come up in recent days is, how do I show my support for Israel, its right to exist, and its response to aggression, keeping all those in mind, as well as being critical of a number of things. Now, I'm kind of feeling like, if I'm talking to you, those discriminations are possible. It can be with people who have the same concerns, being critical, just as when I'm with Catholics, sometimes I can be critical of the Catholic Church, and we all know we love it and are concerned for its future and its well-being. And that's the kind of role that I think is important. So my question there would be, is lack of definition about the terms ultimately just giving in to the politicization of discourse? Or do we have a responsibility, say, from my point of view as Catholics, is to say, look, we know discourse is politicized, but yet teachings that are clear, connected with prudential decisions, are actually the job of the church. So I would say the Compendium of Social Doctrine is working through very nitty-gritty prudential issues, showing directions in which to go. If you lose that importance of definition, I don't know how then you can mount a critique. That's my worry. Just one point to start off with, Karma.
This is great. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll start with what you said in the beginning about Netanyahu and the abuse that we sometimes see of anti-Semitism as like a card that you can always take, and really immunes Israel from every possible critique. So on the one hand, I would say, indeed, there is a case like that. It's very clear. It's clear that Netanyahu does that. It's clear also that Trump does that recently, right, in the universities, that it's all about anti-Semitism. Of course, it's quite clear that it's not all about anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism functions there in a broader political atmosphere. So we definitely see that often in many contexts. That's true. We should also remember that Jews are more or less the only community that once you say anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, you basically tell them that they cannot define the discrimination against them, right? It's like you are not going, men will not judge when a woman feels that she's being harassed. So there is something here that really kind of puts a very strong wall that blocks the Jewish experience of communities that really sense this. And also we see, you said that there are various kinds of anti-Zionism. Some are anti-Semitic, some are not. Again, I don't think that there should be, maybe this is not even, we don't have to discuss the question whether it's anti-Semitic or not, but basically we can discuss when it is evil, and that's I think is important. And of course, negating the very existence of a state, give me one more state that you consider whether to negate or not. I mean, this really doesn't exist. It's not, this is anti-Zionism. It's not like the Bund before, Jewish communities that resisted Zionism before the state was established. It's a completely different story. Now to to dismember a state, this is something that you cannot even imagine this coming through without violence. So here I think this is evil, and today this is anti-Zionism. It's not criticism of Israel. Criticism of Israel is we have different forms of Zionism. We want the good stuff, right? We want to rebuild. We are very worried about the future of Israel. I don't know any Israeli that will not share this concern. So, but it's very clear, even emotionally, it's clear for us when this is each case, it's very clear. It's very hard to miss out the point. When Israel is presented as the repugnant other, that there is no dialogue with, that is completely boycotted, and there is no complexity there. It's simply a settler colonial fact, and that's it. It's very different than saying your war is brutal. This does not, it has to end. It's etc. And I don't want to start, but you know where it's going, right? So I think these are important points. Now to go back to the definition issue, yes, indeed, you're right. But at the moment, perhaps it's good to start with the fact that the definitions are now a trap. What we have available is a trap. Right? It's a labyrinth. It doesn't do good. It's polarizing our societies. It's not helping. So maybe definitions are not necessarily, I don't think that, I'm also, a scholar. I have to use definitions and I have to use categories. There's no other way. I'm thinking about anti-Semitism, how to formulate it all the time. But I would like to be very careful in using the present categories because I think they're very bad for all of us. So if you want to define, you have to start anew, start someplace else. I don't know. It's we can think about it, but that's I think we have to deconstruct before deconstruct the current discourse. Before going in not adopting any of these directions. So this is what I wanted to say about this. And somehow it connects with what I wanted to highlight and actually gave me a lot of food for thought. So in a way, since I'm a historian, I never, so these fine definitions, these fine discernments, is there a word, discernments in English? Yeah, okay, that you're making between the development of the doctrine and everything else, that somehow it's like, it's the historical, the contingent noise in a way, right? It can be important, it can be, things can be picked up from there and then inserted into the doctrine at some point, but basically one has to define, because the church, as it evolves through what is in the end marked as doctrine, as magisterial teaching. And this is really interesting to me now, navigating this, indeed, this very volatile moment. And also I can appreciate the fact that the church is kind of careful not to hurry too much. I mean, you spoke about how fast it all went, but in a way now we see in the last 2 years that it's not fast in terms of the development of doctrine. There is something that waits in a sense outside of this, and this I find I think it really is helpful and also kind of optimistic. At least this is how I see it.
Yeah. I'll ask one more question and then I'll let you respond to what I said if you wish to. As the issue of educating our communities about our traditions connected with each other, it seems to me there's an intrinsic kind of asymmetry here. Our Catholic tradition engages with possibly a suffocating way initially with the Jewish root. So there's a sense in which Catholic Christians can never get away from their origins in Jewish history and Jewish religion, whereas it's not the same the other way around. I mean, this is not part of your central consciousness. So the idea of educating Catholics seems to me a kind of straightforward job that just needs to be done, and it hasn't been done extensively enough. But I'm kind of wondering what the rationale becomes for educating Jews about this history. And if I give two concrete examples, one example would be some of the minority Talmudic traditions about who Jesus is. Is this something that Jews should be revisiting in the light of common sense of walking ahead? Second example I'd give, and I give this with great sensitivity, but also drawing from your fabulous book, the kind of religious Zionism, which is also deeply nationalistic. And it seems to me in the present government, it cannot be the case that as a Catholic observer, I'm thinking this is, wow, the religious Zionists in Israel, two significant parties upholding Netanyahu's cabinet. This is a kind of Judaism that I really don't like. But I don't know how to express that in a way that is a kind of respectful discourse, but also deeply critical. So I just wondered if you could comment on that issue of education and those two examples.
Yes, absolutely. Right. I think the asymmetry is really difficult because the divisions within the Jewish world are immense, and every community handles these things its own way, and they're very critical towards each other. Sometimes they're completely blocking each other from any kind of collaboration. So it's very hard to say, okay, we're going to now to implement something in the Jewish world. There's no such thing. It just doesn't exist. So there are communities that will implement values of dialogue, etc., and others that won't. And also in terms of interpreting the Jewish tradition, there are various theological reasons to engage with Christians, with other faiths. So you can think about ethical monotheism. I mean, it depends where you start, but for the ways of peace, there are several paths. The Jewish tradition is really full of, you have plenty of options to go. I would also suggest that even though it's not the same dependency, because in a way, right, the Christians share the Hebrew Bible, but Jews don't share the New Testament. But first of all, we know that we share much more now. We know how the entanglements of our traditions has been revealed by biblical scholars and by scholars of early Christianity and rabbinic Judaism, to an extent that it is very hard now to say that there is no influence of Christianity on the evolution of Judaism. Judaism has developed in constant dialogue, also polemic, adaptations, plenty of things with Christianity. Of course, this is something that can be easily acknowledged by academics and circles that are not part of the academic world and are kind of blocking themselves towards academic knowledge will stay out of this, obviously, like in other religions as well. So, and we have several scholars that are also very much involved in Jewish Christian dialogue, like Amy J. Levine, Mark Brettler, that really do. I mean, this is where they're going, right? Exactly, to say, also to reclaim parts of the Christian tradition back to the Jewish tradition, and not to stay with this this mother-daughter idea that the mother has already been completely ripe and consolidated, crystallized, and only the daughter keeps returning to this very ambivalent relationship with the mother. So now we can refrain from that, and I think this is helpful, and to acknowledge our depth, the Jewish tradition's depth to Christianity in terms of activating so many internal processes within Judaism. And this brings me to the final point about religious Zionism. And I will say again that we have some hardcore radicalism within the Jewish society, within the Jewish tradition. We have some very dangerous and very violent interpretations of the Jewish tradition. Perhaps, and they have the power that they never had before, right? They are no longer suppressed. They are in the government. They represent much more than their actual share in the population. This is something that we often forget, right? We neglect to remember. But the reason why they are there is because the more centrist parties in Israel did not want to sit in the government with Bibi Netanyahu. And therefore, Bibi Netanyahu forged his coalition with the most radical parties in Israel. It's not because of the portion they have in the population. But this is definitely changing Israel. It's very dangerous, and people are fighting against it. And it's important to say that it's not only the secular, liberal, educated society that is fighting against it. It's also great portions of religious Zionism that would like to resist it and that do not find this reasonable, acceptable, representative. So even the word religious Zionism, we should be very careful on how we apply it. And of course, this is one of the greatest dangers. We have the external dangers in Israel, which have been very prominent during these last 2 years. But this is definitely one of the greatest threats that we have from within, because it's not only anti-Christian, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab sentiments and ideologies. It is also anti-state. It's against the institutions of the state of Israel very often. And so this is a problem that it's no less a problem for Jews, for a great variety of Jews, than it is for Christians. And I really like the fact that you can say, I don't like this kind of Judaism, because it seems to me that when a Catholic is close enough to the Jewish world that he can differentiate and discern and identify the diversity, of course you will not like everything you see. It's closer to you. Like even in the family, we don't like everybody, right? So, but it's a different dislike than this repugnant other. Now, the demon of Judaism comes out of the bottle. This is something else. So I think there you have the line.
Thanks. I'm not sure, Arthur, if you want us to, I'm aware that you may have a lot of questions coming through, but thank you for those responses, Karma. I would happily carry on, but I'll wait to see what Arthur says.
Well, let me just ask Karma, do you have anything you wanted to respond in turn to Gavin, or we have several questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, I would open it at this point because we're, so we will still have time for discussion.
Yeah.
Very interested in knowing where people are at.
Yeah, no, there's several interesting questions here. So let's see, let me start with one question here from my colleague Sandra Keating. She says, most of my own work has been in Catholic-Muslim dialogue for nearly 40 years. What I've noticed in the past decade in the dialogue groups in which I'm active is rising hysteria and anger among Muslims against Judaism and Israel. The last few meetings we have had have focused entirely on Islamophobia, with overt attacks on Jews in the discussion. I haven't always been effective in answering these claims, and I'm interested in your thoughts, suggestions, and experience. And it's not directed to either, so I guess it's open to either one of you.
Yeah, I would like to hear Gavin's response to this, because of your work also within the realm of Catholic-Muslim dialogue and how you
I think Sandra's question is kind of really getting us to the core of what's the elephant in the room and the difficulties in this whole other area of dialogue. Having been involved in a number of meetings recently, there's a sense in which very often, and I think this is like about knowing the family well, the point that Karma was making earlier, that there are many, many different types of Islam and many different types of practice and understanding of it. But often what is uniting many of it is the concern for the Palestinian people. It's a kind of unitary cause that seems to unite many Muslims. And in that sense, I think, there's a real task for Catholics involved. And I'm kind of touched with Professor Keating's saying maybe I haven't dealt with it, because it's so difficult, isn't it? To stand up and say, hey, this is dealing with caricatures, this is dealing with, and this is where it becomes complicated. As theologians, to start talking about historical political sciences as the center issue, requires a gear change, and it requires quite a difficult task. But I think in terms of our honesty with all partners, we need to be kind of reflecting the voices and concerns that other friends have, so that when speaking to Jewish people, sometimes I found it very difficult to voice my concerns about what is happening in the current dispute, the demonization or equation often of Palestinians with Hamas in much of the discourse. And that needs to be challenged. And with Muslim friends, I think one needs to challenge many of the anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist discourse, but also trying to make a space very much for voices in Islam that are not buying into that, but have great difficulty. I mean, it's kind of coming out and not wanting to speak against the tide. So I think this is actually a very challenging moment for all forms of religious dialogue, both with Jews and with Muslims. And tragically, trying to have Muslims and Jews together is more and more difficult. And that's just not good news. But I think those are the comments I'd want to make.
Thanks, Gavin. I think one thing I'm hearing out of this conversation is, I mean, given where we are now in state of the world and in the state of the dialogue, these kinds of political questions obviously cannot be avoided within sort of religious dialogue. And what I find interesting about that is that Nostra Aetate has that very sort of that phrase that tries to skirt around the religious dialogue being political at all. And it seems like, that's an outdated statement at this point, right? So we can't really skirt around those issues anymore.
And I think just one comment, Arthur, there is that Nostra Aetate's difficulty of even getting off the ground was the danger of it being read as siding with historical political Israel. So this huge effort to kind of deflesh religion into some kind of trope from Romanticism happened unintentionally. But it was Pope Benedict and certainly Pope John Paul II who were very strongly making it clear that social doctrine is to do with making prudential political judgments. And so this kind of split between theology and politics can't carry on for too long within the Catholic discourse. And it's already firmly perhaps united in a lot of Jewish discourse, which is something we can learn from.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Also, in terms of what you're saying about Benedict and John Paul II, I really have to think more with you about that. But I would also like to say that the pressure on Vatican, on the Council, not to include anything that even smells like Israel, for example, the word Israel, is political in its own right, right? The pressure was political theology. So it says that it's not for political reasons, but there are political reasons there for the specific formulation that it's choosing. And this is something that really still accompanies us. And I would like to say one more thing about it, and this is that Jewish-Christian relations have always mixed politics and religion. And we go back to Augustine at this point because the idea of exile and of the destruction of the temple was very strongly stressed in triumphalist Christian theology vis-a-vis Jews and Judaism. So this is something that is kind of always in the background. And then we have this point where we suddenly need to differentiate. But the question of how to handle the religion politics question was part of the debate between Christians and Jews. It was part of the polemic. So I think it's by definition, it is very hard to neutralize. And of course, this is partially, there is a good book by Leo Badnitsky, How Judaism Became a Religion. So it also has to do with the fact that Judaism carries itself very differently in terms of the self-definition, the religious part of Judaism, right? The lines that do not cross the same places as it is for Christianity and for Catholicism. And now I think that this idea that the dialogue with the Jews is completely separate from the way that the political arm of the Vatican deals with the state of Israel, there is something paradoxical about it, because if there is one thing that is common for both the Vatican and the state of Israel, is that both mean much more than their political entity, right? They are very much attached to the peoples involved, the Vatican to the global church, and Israel to global Judaism. So here there is something that is really delicate and volatile, but definitely something that for the future, I think we should consider.
Mm-hmm.
So we have maybe about 5 minutes left and a couple of questions. So maybe we could do a lightning round answer. I don't know if that's possible. These are big questions, but let's give it a shot. So here's a question from Phil Cunningham. Many thanks to my friends Gavin and Karma for their very thoughtful and insightful remarks. I'm fascinated by the discussion of definitions of anti-Semitism and how that topic is easily weaponized. I'd ask what both Karma and Gavin think about how the reality of Jews as a peoplehood affects the definition question.
You want to start?
I think Phil is asking something very profoundly important, because one of the other difficulties of the Council and its definitions was talking about, if you like, religions as opposed to peoples. Mm. And this kind of, you've already mentioned this, Karma. This seems like a kind of product of modernity to start thinking about religions and individual commitment and buy-in. So the notion of peoples is kind of a return to a pre-modern and rather important tradition that Catholicism has slightly lost hold of, and I think could greatly learn from. So it's not like, the question is salvation of individuals being obsessively the focus. It's, again, peoples. But of course, peoples, when it comes to Christian and it comes to Jewish, are very then asymmetrically configured. And I think Phil's comment helps us to go back to this anti-Zionism question, because here we have historically a rare moment in Jewish history where the people can be assembled together and finally have security that they're not under, if you like, the tutelage of Christian power, etc., etc. So, that's very helpful. I think one would need to, as Phil already has done in his own work, think that through further. But I think it's one of the many ingredients that would be vital to move forward in this area. Not a very good answer, but just the beginning of thinking about it. Karma, if you...
Yeah, that's actually great. I mean, thinking about Phil's question and also about your answer. So Phil referred to the definitions of anti-Semitism, but you referred to the definitions of religion. And this is really fascinating because these two realms are actually very much intertwined, right? I mean, this even, for example, this saying that Zionism is racism, it really somehow touches upon the question what Judaism is, who the Jews are, right? What is the place of people who there, And so it seems to me that these are layers that are kind of based on each other. Also, what is the place of religion within anti-Semitism, right? These are all, they're very much entangled with each other. And it seems to me that going back to the question, why should we give up definitions in general? So maybe this is a good starting point to think about these conceptual problems together and see where this can lead us. But that's a wonderful question. I'll think with it more.
Okay, we have a question here for Karma that says, you mentioned that there were some halachic issues that influenced lagging reception of changes in Jewish-Christian relations. What are these halachic issues?
Right. So the main point is something that begins, that kind of bursts in the Middle Ages. And this is the question whether Christianity should be considered as a monotheistic religion or as idolatry. And here the issue, and this is something that should be remembered first and foremost of Maimonides, who represents the strangest approach towards Christianity, is very much an inheritor of Muslim anti-Christian polemic that has a lot of problems with the Trinity. While the Ashkenazi versions are more lenient towards Christianity and invent all kinds of different halachic categories. But the fact is that one of the darkest memories of Jews vis-a-vis Christianity is the 11th century, what we call Praot Tatuno, and now I don't remember the name in English, but everything that happens in Ashkenaz, in France, Germany, this area, in the end of the 11th century, the massacres and the forced conversions, which are the first forced conversions. And there it is very clear that Jews prefer to die, to go through martyrdom and not to convert. And therefore there is something here that remains very difficult, because if you now redefine Christianity as something that has nothing to do with idolatry, then what do you do with this memory of all the martyrs that were willing to give their lives and not convert? So it's very much about maintaining a very firm line between Judaism and Christianity, and this is something that was always much more challenging for Jews. It brings us to the question of mission, and there is always or in many Jewish communities, there is this fear of this missionary zeal, and a very strong sense that boundaries should be carefully maintained. And in radical circles, you see that, the rage against Christianity and the memory of Christianity as the oppressive other is kind of investing or incarnating, sorry for the metaphor, itself in these halachic debates on, what should we do now in terms of now that the let's say the boot of the Christian is no longer on the neck of the Jew. So how should this influence the internal Jewish discourse on Christianity? And definitely, so if tolerance in the past, and this is one of the biggest challenges, I think now, in the past, Jewish tolerance towards other religions, other societies, was very much the tolerance of the minority towards the majority. This was the sociological reality. And this brings with it a series of justifications that is very specific for a minority. And now, for example, in Israel, where Jews no longer have this sense of being a minority, even if globally speaking they still are, we have to have a different set of justifications, which is, it's hard to develop. And you see many rabbis that are very involved in developing it. But in a sense, you really have to reinterpret the sources in order to figure out something of this sort. I hope this was more or less clear.
All right, thank you, Karma. And maybe we can just close it here. There's a quick question in here just asking Gavin if you could provide a reference or two for reference on your final point in future expectations and initiatives from the church. And I think that's on the question of Israel. So is there a book or two you might suggest for people interested in reading up on that?
Well, I mean, the most exciting recent book I have read, which I would suggest everyone should read, is Paul Griffith's book on Israel. Well, a very, very sophisticated, interesting Catholic person thinking through this whole doctrine in quite a remarkable way, moving the positions in all sorts of ways in a very challenging fashion. I disagree with lots of it, but it's one of the most stimulating things, I would say, if you want to think about a future agenda theologically. Read Paul Griffiths. I should say read me, but I would say read Paul Griffith.
You can say read Gavin, right? It sounds better.
Well, we can say it, right? Read Gavin, and I know Phil Cunningham was also involved in a project as well. So there's lots of good resources out there. So we are at time. So I want to thank you both very, very much for a rich, complex, and stimulating discussion today. Certainly all of our eyes will be on Rome and Jerusalem, so to speak, in the coming years. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us today. I have some information on our mailing list if you'd like to join. That's in the chat and on our website. And from us in Providence and all over the world, a good day to everyone, or good night. And we hope to see you at our next event. Thank you very much.